It was just $52 at a Walmart checkout lane. I thought it was a tiny gesture that would fade into the fluorescent night. But exactly 3 weeks later, I walked into a Belle Meade mansion and heard that same woman's voice. They thought they could use me to save their crumbling empire. Their biggest mistake was assuming a woman who knows how to quietly help a stranger wouldn't know how to quietly destroy a family. My name is Lola Austin. I am 34 years old, and I make my living translating the language of human survival into the cold, calculated metrics of corporate healthcare. As a senior reimbursement analyst at Crescent Ridge Cardiac Network in Nashville, my days are measured in denial codes, insurance appeals, and the exhausting reality of arguing over the price of a beating heart. It is a job that demands a clear head and nerves of steel. You cannot afford to let emotion bleed into the spreadsheets when you are staring down thousands of dollars in disputed medical bills. It had been a particularly brutal Tuesday. A massive system-wide billing crash had wiped out 2 days of reconciliations. By the time I clocked out, my eyes were burning from the glare of dual monitors, and the dull throb of a tension headache had settled firmly at the base of my skull. I did not want to be out in the world. All I wanted was to drive back to my small, quiet house in East Nashville, kick off my sensible work shoes, and eat a lukewarm dinner in absolute silence. But my refrigerator was completely empty, a casualty of a 60-hour work week. I needed the bare minimum to survive until the weekend, which led me to the fluorescent purgatory of the local Walmart at 8 o'clock at night. The store was crowded, buzzing with the frantic, exhausted energy of people who were also just trying to get through the end of their day. I grabbed a handbasket, tossed in some coffee, a bag of mixed greens, and a carton of almond milk, and navigated my way toward the checkout lanes. I chose a line that looked relatively short, standing behind a single customer. She was an older woman, perhaps in her late 60s or early 70s. There was nothing flashy about her. She was dressed meticulously but unpretentiously in a tailored beige trench coat, a simple silk scarf neatly tied at her neck, and practical leather loafers. She did not look like someone who belonged under the harsh, buzzing lights of a discount superstore at this hour. Her posture was perfectly straight, her hands resting quietly on the handle of her cart. On the moving belt, her items were arranged with almost mathematical precision. It was the inventory of a solitary, frugal life: a dozen eggs, a half-gallon of milk, a loaf of whole wheat bread, 2 cans of low-sodium chicken soup, a box of Earl Grey tea, and a single roll of paper towels. The cashier, a young kid who looked like he would rather be anywhere else, scanned the items with mechanical indifference. "Your total is $52.08, the cashier mumbled, barely looking up. The woman nodded graciously and slid a dark plastic card into the chip reader. The machine beeped, a sharp, angry sound that cut through the low hum of the store. "Declined," the cashier said, his voice flat. "Want me to try it again?" "Please," the woman replied softly. Her voice was steady, cultured, and carried no trace of panic. The cashier hit a button on his screen. The woman removed the card and inserted it a second time. We all waited. 10 seconds passed, feeling like a lifetime under the harsh glare of the ceiling lights. Beep. "Still declined, ma'am," the cashier sighed, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "You got another card?" "Cash?" The woman did not sigh. She did not rummage frantically through her handbag or offer a breathless, embarrassed excuse about the bank making a mistake. She simply reached forward with quiet, heartbreaking dignity and picked up the carton of milk. "I understand," she said, her tone perfectly even. "I will just put these back. Thank you for your time." It was not the sight of poverty that gripped my chest in that moment. It was the physical shrinking of a proud person in a public space. I knew that exact posture. I had seen it 100 times growing up. I had watched my own mother, Denise, perform that same quiet retreat at grocery store counters, folding herself inward to minimize the shame of not having enough. My mother used to shield my eyes from the cashier's impatience, pretending that leaving the groceries behind was a choice rather than a defeat. Money, or the lack of it, has a way of turning everyday life into a theater of humiliation. I stepped forward before my brain could overthink the logistics. "Put it on here," I said to the cashier, tapping my debit card against the contactless reader. The machine chimed a cheerful, approving tone. The receipt printer whirred to life. The older woman stopped, the carton of milk still clutched in her hands. She turned to look at me, and for the first time, I saw her eyes. They were a piercing, intelligent shade of blue, framed by soft lines of age. She did not look embarrassed or overly emotional. She looked composed and intensely observant. "You do not have to do that," she said quietly. "It is already done," I replied, forcing a brief, tired smile. "It has been a long day for everyone. Please, just take the groceries and have a good night." I did not introduce myself. I did not ask for her name or offer a saccharine speech about paying it forward. I desperately wanted to avoid turning a simple act of decency into a public spectacle. In my experience, charity is easiest to swallow when it comes with no strings and no audience. The woman looked at me for a long moment. It was not a glance of simple gratitude. It felt heavier than that. It felt diagnostic. She was taking my measure, cataloging the dark circles under my eyes, my wrinkled blazer, and the stubborn set of my jaw. "Thank you," she said softly. She placed the milk back into her bag, picked up her groceries, and walked away. She moved with an unhurried, elegant glide that seemed entirely out of place in the chaotic retail environment. I watched her disappear through the sliding glass doors, struck by the unsettling feeling that she had not just thanked me. She had memorized me. I paid for my own small basket of groceries, carried my bags out to my 10-year-old Honda sedan, and drove the familiar route back to East Nashville. The neighborhood was quiet. The modest brick houses huddled close together under the glow of amber streetlights. I unlocked the front door of the small, single-story home my mother had left me, the only piece of real security I possessed in this world. I dropped my keys on the counter, fed the neighbor's stray cat that always lingered on my porch, and finally took off my shoes. As I ate my salad in the silence of my kitchen, I pushed the encounter at the store out of my mind. It was just an isolated moment of kindness, a $52 tax on my own memories of growing up poor. I truly believed the exchange would evaporate into the cool Tennessee night. I had absolutely no idea that by sliding my debit card over that scanner, I had blindly walked onto the battlefield of a violently wealthy family. I went to bed, slept the heavy sleep of the deeply exhausted, and woke up the next morning to the harsh blare of my alarm clock. It was Wednesday, which meant another 8 hours of dissecting medical codes. I shuffled into the kitchen to make coffee. I reached into the reusable grocery bag I had tossed on the table the night before, pulling out the bag of coffee beans. As I did, a small, crisp piece of paper fluttered out from the bottom of the bag and drifted onto the hardwood floor. I frowned. I always declined printed receipts. I bent down and picked it up. It was not a Walmart receipt. It was a thick, textured piece of ivory cardstock, slightly crumpled at the edges. There were no items listed, no totals, no barcodes. There was only a faded, elegant logo stamped at the top, and a name printed in a classic serif font, Vanderbilt and Hayes Fine Jewelers. Below the name was an address located in the heart of Belle Meade, the wealthiest, most exclusive zip code in the entire state. I stared at the slip of paper, the quiet hum of my refrigerator suddenly sounding very loud. I had bagged my own groceries last night. That piece of paper had not been in my bag when I walked into the store. There was only one point of contact, only one brief moment when my bag had been resting on the carousel next to someone else's. It was a tiny, seemingly insignificant piece of debris. But as I held it in the morning light, a strange, cold prickle of curiosity washed over me. The woman with the declined card, buying canned soup and discount bread, had somehow left behind a receipt from a place where a single diamond cost more than my entire house. I had been dating Rhett Vale for roughly 4 months by the time the weather turned unseasonably warm. Rhett was a senior executive at Vale Meridian Development, a sprawling real estate empire that possessed half the commercial skyline in the state of Tennessee. Our paths first crossed at a charity gala for cardiac research, a lavish event my hospital had essentially mandated its senior administrative staff to attend. I vividly remember standing near a ridiculous, towering floral arrangement, sipping sparkling water and mentally calculating how many uninsured bypass surgeries could be funded by the sheer cost of the imported orchids filling the room. That was when Rhett approached me. He did not open the conversation by listing his corporate assets, dropping names, or casually mentioning his family wealth. Instead, he asked me a highly specific question about the hospital's billing infrastructure, a dry topic he had overheard me discussing with a colleague moments prior. More surprisingly, he actually listened to my answer. He held steady eye contact. He asked intelligent follow-up questions. In a ballroom suffocated by men who spoke only to hear their own importance echo off the marble walls, Rhett's quiet, focused attention felt like a sudden rush of clean air. Our relationship progressed rapidly, yet it never felt rushed or overwhelming. There were beautifully understated dinners at tucked-away restaurants, where the heavy menus did not bother to list prices, and long Sunday drives through the rolling green hills far outside the city limits. Rhett seemed utterly captivated by my boundaries. He loved that I insisted on paying my own rent, that I drove an older vehicle, and that I never asked a single question about his family's immense holdings. He would often reach across the table during dinner, cover my hand with his immaculate fingers, and tell me how much he adored that I was not blinded by the lights. At the time, I absorbed the phrase as a profound, intimate compliment. I believed he was validating my grounded nature and my fierce independence. I was entirely unaware that in the calculated language of the ultra-wealthy, praising someone for not looking at the lights is just a strategic way of making sure they do not notice the shadows moving behind the curtain. My reality was constructed from entirely different materials than his. My father passed away when I was very young, leaving my mother, Denise Austin, to raise me on the meager wages of a public school cafeteria worker. She managed our survival with a fierce, calculating grace. Every spare dollar was hoarded, every expense interrogated with military precision. Before she passed away, her decades of relentless, punishing frugality culminated in a single, monumental purchase: a small, solid brick building in a rapidly gentrifying pocket of East Nashville. It was a modest commercial space with a comfortable apartment situated above it, and she owned it free and clear. It was the only asset of true, undeniable value my family had ever possessed in our entire history. To Rhett, real estate was an abstract game of leverage, zoning boards, and tax loopholes. To me, that small brick building was my mother's blood, sweat, and deferred dreams, rendered permanently in masonry and mortar. It was the physical, undeniable proof that we existed, that we had fought, and that we were finally safe from the edge of poverty. Exactly 3 weeks after my strange, isolated encounter at the discount grocery store, Rhett asked me to officially meet his family. We were sitting on the porch of my East Nashville home, the humid evening air thick with the scent of blooming magnolias. He casually mentioned that his parents were hosting an intimate dinner at their sprawling estate in Belle Meade, and that they were eager to finally meet the woman he had been talking so much about. He also noted, with a slight shift in his posture, that his aunt would be in attendance. He spoke of her with a distinct, almost rigid reverence, describing her as the absolute center of gravity in the Vale family orbit. I spent my Saturday afternoon preparing for the dinner. I decided to bake a lemon cake from my mother's worn, handwritten recipe box. I absolutely did not do this to impress a family that undoubtedly employed a staff of private chefs to cater to their daily whims. I did it because I was raised by a woman who taught me that you never cross another person's threshold empty-handed, regardless of how many rooms their house possesses or how many zeros are attached to their bank accounts. The cake was simple, tart, and honest. I carefully wrapped it in a pale yellow bakery box, tied it securely with a thick cotton string, and placed it gently on the passenger seat of Rhett's immaculate German sedan when he arrived to pick me up. The drive to Belle Meade was silent and smooth. insulated from the gritty noise of the city by thick, soundproof glass and superior automotive engineering. As we crossed the invisible, heavily guarded border into the wealthiest, most exclusive zip code in the state, the landscape shifted dramatically. The trees grew older and taller. The lawns expanded into vast, manicured estates, and the houses retreated far behind high stone walls and wrought iron fences. Rhett reached over the center console, resting his hand lightly on my knee. "Are you nervous?" he asked, his voice a soothing, confident baritone. "A little bit," I admitted, looking out the window at the sprawling, intimidating shadows of ancient oak trees. "They are going to love you," he assured me, squeezing my knee affectionately. "Just be exactly who you are. And honestly, if my aunt likes you, everything will be much easier for us." I nodded, brushing the comment off as standard, predictable relationship anxiety. Of course he wanted the family matriarch to approve of his new partner. It sounded like the kind of harmless, typical dynamic that existed in any tight-knit family, whether they lived in a trailer park or a mansion. I did not read the warning hidden within the word easier. We turned off the main, tree-lined avenue and approached a set of towering, imposing iron gates. They swung open silently, recognizing his vehicle, granting us access to a long, winding driveway paved with perfectly crushed white stone. The main house emerged from the darkness like a fortress. It was a sprawling, classical revival structure, illuminated by soft, strategic architectural lighting that made the massive white columns glow ethereally against the dark night sky. It looked less like a home where people lived and more like a private, untouchable institution. As Rhett steered the car around the sweeping curve of the circular driveway, my eyes caught the sudden reflection of the headlights against a discreet, polished brass plaque mounted on a low stone wall near a secondary entrance. It was not meant to be a flashy display, but rather a quiet, administrative distinction for private deliveries or exclusive guests. I read the neatly engraved words as we glided past at a slow crawl. Vale House. Judith Vale Residence. A sudden, inexplicable chill ran down the entire length of my spine, freezing the blood in my veins. The comfortable warmth of the luxury car vanished entirely, replaced by a sharp metallic dread that pooled heavily in the pit of my stomach. The conditioned air suddenly felt entirely too thin to breathe. I clutched the yellow bakery box in my lap, my knuckles turning stark white against the cardboard. The memory of a faded jewelry receipt and a pair of piercing blue eyes under fluorescent lights slammed into my consciousness. I had not even stepped out of the car yet, but the trap had already closed. Rhett guided me up the wide stone steps of the estate. The heavy mahogany double doors swung inward before he even reached for the massive brass handle, opened silently by a man in a dark, tailored suit. I stepped over the threshold onto a floor of highly polished, imported marble that perfectly reflected the soft, golden light of a sprawling crystal chandelier overhead. The air inside the house was exceptionally cool and smelled faintly of fresh white lilies and antique wood. I barely had time to let my lungs expand, barely had time to take a full, steadying breath, when a voice drifted out from the adjoining formal living room. "I know you." The 4 words were spoken with a calm, declarative certainty. They did not carry the upward, inquisitive lilt of a question. I froze. The yellow bakery box resting in my hands suddenly felt as heavy as a solid block of concrete. Footsteps clicked against the marble, slow and deliberate. A figure emerged from the grand archway, stepping out of the shadowed room and into the brilliant light of the foyer. It was her, the woman from the discount grocery store checkout lane. But the beige trench coat and sensible leather loafers were entirely gone. In their place, she wore a tailored charcoal silk blouse and a long, flowing skirt that moved like dark water around her ankles. A heavy, antique emerald pendant rested quietly at her throat. She stood amidst the original oil paintings and towering bronze sculptures, as though she had been born directly from the stone foundation of the house itself. This grand, intimidating fortress was her natural atmosphere. The fluorescent purgatory where I first met her was the illusion. This was the staggering reality. "Aunt Judith," Rhett said, his voice instantly dropping its casual, charming warmth, replaced by a tone of practiced, rigid deference. He turned toward me, placing a hand gently on the small of my back. "This is my aunt, Judith Vale. And Aunt Judith, this is the woman I have been telling you so much about." He looked between the two of us, a confused smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Wait, you two know each other?" My heart hammered violently against my ribs, a frantic rhythm echoing in my ears. I looked at Judith. Her piercing blue eyes were locked firmly onto mine, possessing the exact same intensity they had shown 3 weeks prior. She did not look shocked to see me standing in her foyer. She looked mildly amused, in a dark, quiet, and deeply calculated sort of way. Rhett had spoken of her often, but seeing her standing here crystallized all of his fragmented stories into a terrifying whole. Judith Vale was a widow, a notoriously secretive private investor, and the undisputed, ruthless architect of the family's immense fortune. She held the controlling shares in their primary asset fund. A local business journal had recently published a rare profile on her, dubbing her the woman who never needs to enter a boardroom to control every single person inside it. My mind spun dangerously, struggling to reconcile the vast, impossible distance between the woman who could not afford a $52 grocery bill and the billionaire standing just an arm's length away from me. It was not the staggering amount of money surrounding me that made my throat tighten. It was the terrifying, looming question of why. Why would a woman of her unimaginable means be standing in that checkout line with a declined card, buying cheap canned soup? Before my panicked brain could formulate a rational answer, Judith stepped forward. "We have not officially met," Judith said smoothly, her voice betraying absolutely nothing to her nephew. "But Nashville is a small town when you pay attention to the right people. You brought something." She extended her hand gracefully toward the yellow box. "It is a lemon cake," I managed to say, my voice sounding far too thin and fragile in the cavernous room. "My mother's recipe. How incredibly thoughtful," she replied. She took the box from my hands. Her cool fingers briefly brushed against mine, and for a split second, the polite, aristocratic veneer cracked just enough for me to see the raw, calculating intelligence burning underneath. She did not mention the grocery store. She did not mention the money I had paid, but her sharp eyes told me unequivocally that she remembered every single detail of that night. Rhett exhaled a small laugh, completely oblivious to the silent, high-voltage current snapping violently between us. "Well, let us head into the dining room. My parents are eager to finally see you." The dining room was a masterclass in aggressive intimidation perfectly disguised as elegant hospitality. The table was a massive slab of dark walnut, set with heavy antique silver and crystal goblets that caught the ambient light like shattered diamonds. Conrad and Sylvia Vale sat at the far end, looking exactly like they had been cast by a major studio in a film about generational wealth. Conrad was a tall, silver-haired man with a booming, practiced laugh that never quite reached his eyes. Sylvia was flawlessly preserved, draped in muted cashmere, her smile polished to a blinding, weaponized shine. As we sat down, the interrogation officially began. It was not a clumsy or direct line of questioning. It was executed with the terrifying, seamless grace of highly skilled predators. They served an exquisitely plated course of seared scallops, and with every polite bite, they slowly dismantled my history. Sylvia asked about my childhood with maternal concern. Conrad asked about my position at the Cardiac Network with genuine-sounding professional curiosity. They were overwhelmingly, suffocatingly polite. They nodded sympathetically when I mentioned my father passing away when I was young, and they heavily praised my strong work ethic, but the conversation did not linger on my career or my personal ambitions for very long. It shifted, with an unnatural, practiced speed, toward real estate. "Rhett tells us you live over in East Nashville," Conrad noted casually, taking a slow sip of his dark red wine. "The market over there has absolutely exploded in the last 5 years. Did you purchase the property recently?" "No," I answered, keeping my voice carefully level. though a distant warning bell began to chime softly in the back of my mind. It belonged to my mother. She left it to me. Ah, Sylvia chimed in immediately, leaning forward slightly, her eyes glittering with a sudden, razor-sharp interest. A brick building, Rhett mentioned? Commercial space on the bottom, residential on top? I glanced quickly at Rhett. He was busy cutting his food, seemingly unaware of the sudden, drastic shift in the atmospheric pressure at the table. Why had he described the specific commercial zoning of my property to his parents? Yes, I said cautiously, choosing my words with extreme care. It is modest, but it is solid. Sylvia set her silver fork down with a delicate, deliberate clink against the fine china plate. She looked directly at me, her flawless smile tightening just a fraction of an inch. That is incredibly impressive, Sylvia said, her voice dripping with a honeyed sweetness that instantly made the skin on my arms crawl. A daughter who knows how to keep family assets is rare these days. Most young people would have liquidated a prime piece of real estate like that the moment they inherited it, just to buy something frivolous. But you held on to it. Free and clear. The words hung suspended in the chilled air. Heavy and loaded with unspoken implications. It was not a compliment. It was a financial appraisal. The soft warning bell in my head abruptly stopped chiming and began to scream. I looked around the sprawling table. Conrad was watching me with a calculated, quiet hunger. Sylvia was studying my face exactly like a forensic accountant reviewing a ledger. I suddenly realized with horrifying clarity that I was not sitting in this velvet-upholstered chair as Rhett's beloved partner. I was not a welcomed guest. I was a dossier. I was a pristine piece of collateral being carefully examined by a board of directors to determine if I was worth acquiring. Through it all, Judith sat at the head of the table, eating her meal in near absolute silence. She watched her brother and sister-in-law with a look of detached boredom, occasionally letting her sharp, analytical gaze flick over to my face. She was observing a trap being meticulously set, but she was not the one springing the jaws. Dessert arrived shortly after. The lemon cake I had brought was sliced and served on porcelain plates that likely cost more than my first car. The conversation shifted effortlessly back to safe trivialities, discussing country club renovations, upcoming hospital charity galas, and the oppressive Tennessee summer heat. As the long evening finally wound down, Rhett and his father moved to the ornate wooden sideboard to pour themselves glasses of dark, violently expensive bourbon. I remained seated at the table with Sylvia and Judith. Rhett raised his crystal glass toward his aunt, his posture shifting right back into that same rigid, nervous deference I had noticed in the foyer. "To a highly successful quarter," Rhett proposed, his voice ringing loudly across the quiet room. "And to the Ashdown Landing project. I am telling you, Aunt Judith, once we finally break ground, it will redefine the entire waterfront district." Judith picked up her water glass, swirling the ice cubes slowly. "We will see, Rhett. The board still needs to heavily review the final risk assessments before I authorize the capital release. You know very well that I do not sign off on hundreds of millions of dollars based on enthusiasm alone." "I know," Rhett said, offering his signature boyish, charming smile that usually disarmed everyone in his path. "But I also know you hold the deciding vote next week, and I know I have put together an absolutely airtight proposal." My breath caught painfully in my throat. I stared at the dark amber liquid in Rhett's glass, feeling the massive room physically tilt on its axis. Hundreds of millions of dollars. The deciding vote. Rhett was desperately chasing a massive, legacy-defining development project, and the single person holding the absolute tyrannical power to either fund it or kill it was sitting right next to me. The very same woman I had paid $52 for at a discount grocery store exactly 3 weeks ago. I looked at Judith. She was already looking at me. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her water, placed the glass quietly back onto the polished walnut table, and offered me a smile so remarkably small it was practically a ghost. The puzzle pieces violently snapped together in my mind, forming a picture so profoundly ugly and terrifying it made my hands shake under the table. My encounter with Judith Vale was not a random collision of fate. The declined credit card, the cheap canned soup, the embossed jewelry receipt left perfectly behind in my grocery bag to ensure I knew she had money. It was not a coincidence. It was a meticulously staged audition. The heavy oak doors of the dining room closed behind us, muting the clink of expensive crystal and the low murmur of his parents' calculated conversation. Rhett placed a warm, guiding hand on the small of my back and led me through the towering French doors into the sprawling rear gardens of the Vale estate. The night air was thick with the heavy scent of night-blooming jasmine and damp, manicured earth. Wrought iron lanterns cast soft, amber pools of light across the perfectly symmetrical stone pathways. It was a setting engineered for romance, a heavily funded imitation of a fairy tale designed to overwhelm the senses. "I am so glad you finally met them," Rhett murmured, his voice dropping to a smooth, intimate register. He pulled me close as we stopped near a massive tiered stone fountain. The water trickled with a rhythmic, hypnotic sound. "They absolutely adored you." I knew they would. He looked down at me, his handsome face partially shadowed by the dim lighting. He began to paint a picture of our shared future, his words flowing with a practiced, flawless ease. He spoke of an official engagement by early autumn, right when the leaves in the Tennessee Valley turned a brilliant gold. He talked about purchasing a sprawling house in a gated neighborhood just a few miles from his parents, a place with enough rooms for a growing family and a vast lawn for entertaining. Every sentence was perfectly timed, every sentiment flawlessly delivered. It was a beautiful, seamless monologue. But after the chilling of forensic interrogation I had just endured at the dinner table, his perfectly constructed future felt less like a romantic promise and more like a carefully drafted corporate acquisition strategy. The air in the sprawling garden suddenly felt terribly thin, suffocating in its perfection. The very next morning, the grand illusion of romance evaporated entirely, replaced by the cold, efficient machinery of wealth management. I was sitting at my small kitchen table in East Nashville, sipping black coffee before heading to the hospital, when a private courier knocked sharply on my front door. He handed me a thick, heavy envelope embossed with the crest of a prominent local law firm. Almost simultaneously, my phone buzzed with an incoming email from Sylvia Vale's executive assistant. The tone of the email was aggressively cheerful. It explained that Sylvia was absolutely thrilled about Rhett and my serious steps toward a permanent future together. Enclosed was a standard premarital financial consulting package. The assistant assured me it was merely a smart, routine procedure to ensure both parties were protected, a completely normal formality for a family managing complex corporate structures. I tore open the heavy paper envelope. I spend 40 hours a week dissecting convoluted medical billing codes, aggressive insurance loopholes, and predatory hospital pricing. I am not intimidated by dense legal jargon. I bypassed the standard non-disclosure agreements and the baseline prenuptial clauses detailing spousal support waivers. My eyes scanned the thick paragraphs until they snagged on a separate, securely attached proposal buried near the back. It was a drafted operating agreement for the creation of a new limited liability company, officially named River Thread Holdings. The document outlined a mutual contribution of initial assets to fund this new corporate entity. Rhett was listed as contributing a block of unvested stock options from Vale Meridian Development. My required contribution was listed not by a simple street address, but by a highly specific string of county assessor data. Parcel 42, Block 7, lot dimension codes indicating a mixed-use commercial and residential footprint in Davidson County. I felt a cold drop of sweat slide slowly down my spine. They had not even used the street name to mask what they were actively trying to do. It was the exact, undeniable legal description of my mother's brick building in East Nashville. I met Rhett for lunch at his private country club later that afternoon. The sprawling dining room was filled with the muted hum of wealthy patrons and the sharp clatter of heavy silver against fine porcelain. Rhett looked entirely relaxed, deeply in his element, wearing a tailored navy blazer and a perfectly crisp collar. When our salads arrived, I pulled the proposal out of my leather bag and placed it squarely on the crisp white tablecloth directly between us. River Thread Holdings, I said, keeping my voice entirely devoid of emotion, locking my eyes onto his. You want me to sign my mother's building over to a newly formed company? Rhett did not flinch. He did not look surprised. He offered a gentle, patronizing smile, the exact kind a patient teacher gives a deeply confused student. He leaned forward, adopting his best, most persuasive executive posture. It is just a highly efficient tax strategy, Lola, he explained smoothly, reaching across the table to cover my hand with his. I did not pull away, though my skin instantly crawled under his touch. Your property is completely dormant right now. It is a sleeping asset. By rolling it into a joint LLC, we can leverage Vale Meridian's massive development resources to aggressively upgrade the commercial space below. I just want to help it generate real, substantial profit for our future. It protects you from personal liability while maximizing the yield. His explanation was a stunning masterpiece of corporate doublespeak. He made the attempted legal absorption of my only family inheritance sound like an act of profound, generous love. If this is genuinely about our long-term future, I asked, keeping my gaze ruthlessly locked on his face. Why does the paperwork require an immediate signature? We are not even officially engaged yet. Why is there a massive rush to transfer the deed this week? The manufactured warmth vanished from Rhett's eyes so fast, it was physically jarring. His jaw tightened imperceptibly. He slowly withdrew his hand from mine. Sitting back against the leather upholstery of his chair, he immediately deployed the most dangerous, manipulative weapon available in any relationship. I thought we were building a partnership, Rhett said, his voice dropping into a tone of deep, wounded disappointment. I am actively trying to bring you into my life, to protect your hard-earned assets with the best legal minds in the entire state, and you are sitting here treating me like a hostile contractor. Do you really have this little trust in me? He effortlessly twisted my entirely reasonable hesitation into a glaring, fatal character flaw. He was actively trying to make me feel overwhelmingly guilty for reading the fine print of my own financial execution, before I could formulate a measured, devastating response. A shadow fell across the pristine white tablecloth. I looked up. Judith Vale was standing there. She had apparently been having afternoon tea in the adjacent, sunlit solarium. She wore a sharp, structured ivory blazer, her posture impossibly rigid and commanding. She did not look at Rhett. Her piercing blue eyes dropped directly to the thick stack of legal documents resting ominously next to my crystal water glass. The detached, mildly amused expression she had worn at the dinner table the night before was completely gone. As she stared at the bold title page of the River Thread Holdings proposal, her face hardened into something sharp, cold, and intensely vigilant. It was the distinct look of a seasoned chess player realizing an opponent had just made a massive, deeply reckless error on the board. Rhett, Judith said softly, her tone carrying the absolute, crushing weight of a direct command. Do not let your lunch get cold. She did not say a single word to me. She simply lifted her chin and met my eyes for one fleeting, terribly heavy second. The message transmitted in that silent gaze was unmistakable. It was not a warm familial greeting. It was a blaring, red alert warning. She turned gracefully and walked away, her low heels clicking sharply against the polished hardwood floor. I left the country club an hour later feeling as though the air had been entirely sucked out of my lungs. I drove the familiar route back to East Nashville in complete, heavy silence. The bizarre incident at the discount grocery store checkout lane was clearly no longer just a strange test of character. My small, quiet act of paying for her groceries had fundamentally altered the way Judith Vale perceived me, and that sudden shift in perception was causing massive, silent panic within the highest ranks of her family. They needed me locked down, legally bound, and financially absorbed before I could figure out why. That night, I sat entirely alone in my dark living room, the harsh glow of my laptop screen illuminating the cracked plaster walls. I opened the digital copy of the premarital package Sylvia's assistant had sent over. I bypassed the dense legal text entirely and opened the document properties window to view the file's embedded metadata. I needed to see the digital fingerprints of the file. I stared at the glowing screen, my blood turning to absolute ice in my veins. Author: Vale Meridian, Legal Department. Date created: 14 days ago. I closed the laptop slowly, the mechanical click sounding incredibly loud in the empty house. Rhett had taken me into the fragrant, sprawling garden just last night to sell me a beautiful dream of a fall wedding and a shared life. But the intricate legal framework specifically designed to strip me of my family's only tangible asset had been drafted on his company's internal servers 2 full weeks before he ever mentioned the word marriage to me. The romantic proposal was nothing but a beautiful, heavily rehearsed cover story for a dirty, desperate transaction. Exactly 3 days passed in a state of suffocating, suspended animation. I went to my office, processed medical claims, answered Rhett's text messages with carefully manufactured warmth, and pretended I was not standing on the absolute edge of a meticulously designed financial trap. I spent my evenings staring at the ceiling, turning the metadata from the legal files over and over in my mind. On Saturday morning, a sharp, solitary knock at my front door shattered the quiet of my house. I was wearing faded denim and a loose cotton sweater, holding a mug of black coffee. I did not expect any deliveries, and Rhett had told me he was spending the entire morning on a golf course with potential investors. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the heavy wooden door inward. Judith Vale stood on my narrow concrete porch. She was entirely alone. There was no idling black luxury SUV at the curb, no hovering personal assistant clutching a tablet, and no driver waiting in the wings. She wore a sharply tailored charcoal blazer over a crisp white silk blouse, looking completely alien against the backdrop of my quiet, working-class street. She stepped into my life exactly like a sudden shift in atmospheric pressure, silent but carrying massive, undeniable weight. "May I come in?" Judith asked. Her voice was calm, perfectly level, and entirely devoid of the aristocratic distance she had weaponized at her brother's dining table. I stepped back, opening the door wider. I did not offer a polite, empty greeting. The time for social pleasantries had violently expired the moment I checked the digital fingerprints on my prenuptial agreement. Judith walked into my modest living room. She did not cast a critical eye over the worn upholstery of my sofa or the cracked plaster near the baseboards. She moved with the distinct, focused grace of a woman who only ever looks at the absolute center of the board. She took a seat in the armchair opposite my small coffee table, resting her leather handbag beside her feet. "I imagine you have spent the last 72 hours feeling entirely out of your depth," Judith began, folding her hands in her lap. "And I imagine you believe the incident at the grocery checkout was a deeply orchestrated test of your character." I sat down heavily on the sofa, clutching my coffee mug with both hands to keep them from shaking. "Was it not?" "No," Judith said softly, her piercing blue eyes locking onto mine. "It was a catastrophic banking error. My wealth management firm initiated a sweeping security freeze across all of my primary accounts due to a series of fraudulent international wire attempts. I had grabbed an old, deactivated secondary card from a desk drawer by mistake. I did not realize I was entirely without liquid funds until the machine rejected the chip for the second time." She paused, letting the mundane reality of the situation settle into the quiet room. "I apologize," Judith continued, her tone dropping into something dangerously close to genuine regret. "I am well aware that the bizarre coincidence of our meeting made you feel as though you were being aggressively evaluated from the shadows. I do not owe you $52.08. I owe you the truth." I stared at her, my mind working frantically to process this sudden breach of the family fortress. "Why are you here? Rhett made it perfectly clear that you hold the keys to his entire corporate kingdom. If he is trying to strip my assets through a shell company, why would you step in to warn me?" "Because my nephew is playing an incredibly reckless game of financial roulette," Judith replied, her voice sharpening into a cold, lethal blade. "Ashdown Landing is not the triumphant, legacy-defining project Rhett and his father claim it is. It is bleeding cash at an absolutely staggering rate, The primary development account is severely illiquid. They are currently burning through their reserves just to keep the construction permits active. She leaned forward slightly, the elegant mask dropping to reveal the ruthless corporate strategist underneath. The bank has threatened to pull their financing, Judith explained, delivering the words with surgical precision. To secure an emergency extension on their bridge loan, the underwriters demanded additional, entirely clean collateral. They need an asset that carries absolutely no existing debt, no hidden liens, and no convoluted corporate history. My building, I whispered, the crushing weight of the revelation pressing down on my chest. They need my mother's building. Precisely, Judith confirmed. Conrad and Sylvia desperately want to pull you into the family structure through marriage. You provide the perfect public relations narrative. The decent, grounded, scandal-free girl who anchors their ambitious son. But more importantly, you provide a pristine balance sheet. They are trying to absorb your unencumbered property to satisfy the bank examiners and artificially inflate their leverage. A cold, terrifying realization washed over me. I thought back to the dinner party, to the sickeningly sweet way Sylvia had praised me for holding on to my family asset. I thought of the garden, where Rhett had wrapped his arms around me and painted a picture of a shared future, all while holding a legal knife to my throat. But Rhett said you hold the deciding vote, I argued, my voice tight with rising anger. He said you were going to authorize the capital release next week. Judith offered a smile so devoid of warmth it actually chilled the room. I have absolutely no intention of releasing another dime from the family fund to cover their gross mismanagement, Judith stated flatly. I have not agreed to any further disbursements. Conrad and Sylvia are orchestrating a massive theater of stability. They are projecting overwhelming confidence to their investors, to the country club, and to you, while behind closed doors, they are drowning. My grip on the ceramic mug tightened until my knuckles ached. The man I had shared my bed with, the man who had effortlessly integrated himself into my life, viewed me as nothing more than a life raft to keep his sinking ambition afloat. I was not a partner. I was a desperate financial acquisition. I need to call him, I said, my voice vibrating with a sudden, violent surge of adrenaline. I need to put that paperwork on his desk and watch his face when I tell him the entire wedding is off. No, Judith commanded. The word cracked like a whip across the small room. I stopped, looking at her in shock. Do not confront them, Judith warned, her voice dropping to a low, intense register. You have uncovered one set of documents. You have no idea what other contingencies they have drafted in the dark. My brother is a desperate man, and desperate men backed into a corner do not fight fair. If you flip the table right now, they will immediately spin the narrative. They will bury you in aggressive litigation, tie your property up in frivolous legal disputes for years, and bleed you dry through attorney fees until you are forced to surrender the deed just to survive. She stood up slowly, smoothing the invisible wrinkles from her tailored skirt. She was giving me the most terrifying advice I had ever received, and she was entirely correct. You do not fight an opponent when you do not know exactly how many loaded weapons they have pointed at your head, Judith said, picking up her leather handbag. You let them believe their strategy is working. You let them build their glass house entirely around you, and then, when they are perfectly comfortable, you shatter the foundation. I remained seated, staring up at the woman who commanded a billion-dollar empire. She was not a fairy godmother, and she was not my friend. She was a tactical observer stepping onto the battlefield to hand me a weapon, simply because she despised the way her own family was breaking the rules of engagement. Judith walked toward the front door, her low heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor. She stopped with her hand resting on the brass knob. She turned her head, her piercing eyes sweeping over the cracked plaster walls, the modest furniture, and finally settling on my face. Your mother did not just leave you a small brick building, Judith said softly, the weight of her words hanging heavily in the quiet air. She left you the single most powerful tool in any negotiation. She left you something my family is currently desperate, bleeding, and begging for. Judith opened the door, the bright morning sunlight instantly flooding the shadowed entryway. "She left you leverage," Judith finished. The heavy wooden door clicked shut behind her, leaving me entirely alone in the silence of my home. I looked down at the cold cup of coffee in my hands. I was no longer a heartbroken woman grieving the end of a relationship. I was a structural integrity analyst, and I was about to carefully, methodically, and ruthlessly map out the exact stress points of the Vale family empire. I did not cry when Judith Vale walked out of my front door. Crying is a luxury reserved for people who have a safety net to fall back into when their world collapses. When you grow up the way I did, panic is a useless emotion. Instead, I walked into my kitchen, poured the cold coffee down the sink, and picked up my phone. I dialed the only person I trusted to navigate the labyrinth of commercial property records without asking a single unnecessary question. Maren Pike and I grew up on the exact same street. She was a senior title researcher for a massive commercial mortgage firm downtown, a woman who viewed the entire world exclusively through the lens of deeds, liens, and zoning variances. We met at a crowded diner on the edge of the city during her lunch break. I slid the printed proposal for River Thread Holdings across the laminated table, along with a scrap of paper bearing the name of Rhett's massive development project, Ashdown Landing. I asked her to run every single shadow search she had access to, utilizing every database her corporate clearance allowed. Maren is brilliant precisely because she is ruthlessly efficient. 2 days later, she called me from a secure conference room at her office and told me to open my personal email. The file she sent me was thick with county records and corporate registrations. Maren had systematically traced the legal plumbing of River Thread Holdings. Rhett had looked me directly in the eyes over a pristine white tablecloth and sold me a story about a tax strategy designed for our newly shared future. But the documents Maren uncovered proved the company was not a post-wedding financial plan at all. The articles of incorporation had been quietly filed with the state 8 months prior. It was an entirely empty corporate shell, a legal cage constructed long before I ever came into the picture, just sitting dormant and waiting. The only sections left blank were the exact property description and the required signature of the contributing member. My stomach twisted into a tight, hard knot, but I forced myself to keep digging. I went back to the digital prenuptial package Sylvia's assistant had originally emailed me. Executive assistants at that high of a level manage dozens of crises a day. They are moving incredibly fast, and occasionally, they get sloppy. I opened the raw digital file and began expanding the collapsed email threads buried deep beneath the primary message. I scrolled past the polite introductions, past the standard legal boilerplate, digging all the way down to the original, internal communication chain. There it was, sitting at the very bottom like a venomous snake in the grass. It was a brief, urgent message sent directly from Sylvia's executive assistant to Vale Meridian's internal legal counsel. It read, "If Austin signs, bridge extension closes by Friday. Not Lola, not Rhett's fiancé, just Austin." I was not a person to them. I was a distressed asset class, a final administrative hurdle standing between them and their desperately needed capital. The financial manipulation was sickening, but the true devastating blow arrived later that same evening. Rhett came over to my house, bringing an expensive bottle of red wine and playing the role of the exhausted but endlessly devoted partner. While he stepped into my bathroom to take a quick shower, his phone vibrated loudly against the marble kitchen counter. I knew his passcode. He had given it to me months ago to change the music while we were driving up to the mountains. I picked up the heavy device and swiped my thumb across the glass. The notification was a text message from Celeste Brody, the high-powered, fiercely aggressive public relations director for the Ashdown Landing project. I opened the thread. They were not discussing press releases or community outreach strategies. Celeste had asked for a concrete update on the collateral acquisition, pressing him on whether the East Nashville property was fully secured for the bank's underwriting committee. Rhett had replied just 20 minutes before arriving at my house. His message read, "Stop panicking. She is completely soft. I am handling the timeline. She is the clean deed they cannot refuse. I stood completely still in my kitchen, the bright screen illuminating the dark space around me. The words burned themselves directly into my retinas. The clean deed they cannot refuse. That was the exact moment the final, pathetic shred of my romantic hope completely died. I suddenly understood everything. I was not a woman he loved for her sincerity, her independence, or her grounded nature. In the eyes of the most ruthless, toxic part of Rhett Vale, I was merely a financial solution wearing a skirt. My entire relationship was a highly orchestrated corporate merger, and my heart was just collateral damage. The next morning, the scope of their criminality deepened even further. Marin flagged a highly suspicious document filed in the county's preliminary assessment portal. Someone at Vale Meridian had quietly ordered a commercial appraisal on my mother's building. In my daily job at the hospital, I spend hours hunting down mismatched medical billing codes and aggressively inflated insurance claims. I know exactly what deliberate fraud looks like on paper. When I opened the attached appraisal report, I felt a sharp, cold jolt of absolute disgust. The document aggressively, almost comically, inflated the market value of my modest brick building. To justify this astronomical number to the bank examiners, the appraiser had attached tight, heavily cropped photographs of the newly renovated multi-million-dollar luxury loft complex located on the adjacent block, deliberately passing them off as my property. It was a brazen, undeniable misrepresentation. They were actively preparing to submit a deeply fraudulent loan application to a major financial institution, and they absolutely needed my signature on the LLC transfer to legitimize the entire criminal package. I did not shatter. I did not drive to Rhett's pristine corporate office and scream at him in the lobby. I did not shed a single tear. I did something far more dangerous. I became utterly silent. I became organized. I stopped thinking like a betrayed, heartbroken girlfriend and immediately started thinking like a survivor navigating a hostile takeover. I took a half-day off from the hospital and drove to an unassuming, poorly lit office park in the deep suburbs. I met with a highly discreet, notoriously aggressive real estate attorney Marin had heavily recommended, a man who had absolutely no social or professional ties to the Vale family empire. I paid his substantial retainer entirely in cash. Under his direct guidance, we spent the afternoon building an impenetrable, absolute legal fortress around my mother's deed. We drafted and filed a highly specific, restrictive addendum with the county clerk's office. The new legal mandate required that any transfer, lien, or encumbrance placed upon my property necessitated my physical, verified presence. Furthermore, it required 2 independent forms of identification and a separate, notarized affidavit signed directly in front of a sitting county judge. Rhett could not simply slip a property transfer document into a towering stack of wedding catering contracts and ask me to sign quickly while I was distracted. He could not forge my name. The building was officially locked down, secure within a legal vault that his corporate lawyers could not quietly pick open. I drove back to East Nashville that evening as the humid summer sun set over the city skyline. I gripped the steering wheel of my old Honda, my hands perfectly steady, my breathing slow and controlled. A massive psychological shift had occurred within me over the last 48 hours. For the first time since this nightmare began, I was no longer asking myself the agonizing question of whether Rhett actually loved me. That question was irrelevant now. As I parked my car in front of the brick building my mother had bled for, my mind pivoted to the only question that truly mattered. Once Rhett realizes I have locked down the deed, once he understands that the clean asset is entirely out of his reach and his multi-million-dollar project is going to collapse, exactly how far is he willing to go to destroy me? I spent the next 4 days performing the most exhausting and demanding role of my entire life. I continued to attend the mandatory social dinners, the charity cocktail hours, and the private gallery openings with Rhett, my hand resting lightly on his forearm, a serene and compliant smile firmly fixed on my face. I did not flinch when he introduced me to his colleagues. I did not pull away when he kissed my temple for the cameras. To the outside observer, and more importantly, to Rhett himself, The brief hesitation I had shown at the country club had completely evaporated. I let him believe that his heavy emotional manipulation had worked perfectly, that the sheer gravity of his affection had crushed my working-class paranoia. He believed I was softening. He had no idea I was simply letting him walk further out onto the freezing ice. On a bright Sunday morning, I agreed to attend a private family brunch hosted at the Vale estate. Sylvia had called me the previous afternoon, her voice bubbling with manufactured excitement, suggesting a small, intimate gathering to discuss the preliminary details of a fall wedding. I arrived wearing a soft floral dress that made me look incredibly approachable and harmless. I also brought the thick stack of financial documents, tucked discreetly inside my oversized leather tote bag. My aggressive real estate attorney had spent hours color-coding the hidden traps within the paperwork. I brought the file not because I intended to sign it, but because I needed to see exactly how they planned to slide the poisoned chalice across the table. And more importantly, I needed to see which member of the family was desperate enough to push the hardest. The brunch was staged on the sun-drenched southern terrace. Overlooking the sprawling, manicured lawns, crystal pitchers of freshly squeezed orange juice and expensive champagne sweated perfectly in the humid heat. Sylvia immediately orchestrated a strategic seating arrangement, effectively trapping me between herself and a massive arrangement of white hydrangeas, creating an isolated bubble for what she warmly dubbed a simple women-only conversation. Before Sylvia could launch into her rehearsed dialogue, the heavy glass doors opened, and Judith stepped out onto the terrace. She wore a severe, dark navy suit, completely rejecting the relaxed, sunlit atmosphere. She did not greet me warmly. She offered a stiff, barely perceptible nod in my direction and took a seat at the far end of the table, projecting an aura of absolute, freezing disdain. I watched Sylvia and Conrad exchange a quick, triumphant glance. They fundamentally misread the temperature of the room. They believed Judith's calculated coldness meant she had firmly realigned herself with the family's aggressive strategy, that she was silently punishing me for daring to question their legal drafts. Their profound arrogance blinded them entirely. Judith's performance gave them a massive surge of premature confidence, making them dangerously loose with their words. Sylvia leaned in close, pouring me a glass of champagne. Her perfume was overpowering. She began with the soft, universally disarming topics: silk organza fabrics, exclusive caterers, and the logistics of managing a massive guest list. She spoke of marriage as a beautiful merging of two separate lives into a single, impenetrable fortress. Then, with the terrifying smoothness of a seasoned predator, she pivoted. "Rhett is just so incredibly stressed right now." Sylvia sighed, resting a perfectly manicured hand on my wrist. "He wants everything to be perfect for you, Lola. He wants the foundation of your marriage to be absolutely secure. That is exactly why he is so focused on consolidating everything under the new holding company. Once we push past this final extension on the development side, he will finally have the time to focus entirely on the wedding." My heart slammed against my ribs, but my face remained an absolute mask of polite sympathy. The final extension. The Vale family had spent months projecting a flawless image of infinite capital, pretending the Ashdown Landing project was an unstoppable juggernaut of success. Yet here was Sylvia, completely intoxicated by her own perceived dominance, casually dropping a phrase that confirmed every single terrible thing Judith had warned me about. She had just handed me a verbal confession worth more than any subpoenaed bank record, right on cue. Rhett walked out onto the terrace, pulling up a chair directly beside me. He wrapped his arm around my shoulders, pressing a warm kiss to my cheek. He smoothly picked up the thread his mother had dropped, escalating the psychological pressure. "My mother is right," Rhett murmured, his voice thick with sincerity. "If we are going to be a true family, Lola, we have to start thinking like one. Putting our assets into a reasonable, unified structure is not about control. It is about building a wall around our future so nothing can ever touch us." I looked down at my plate, letting my shoulders drop slightly, projecting the exact image of a woman torn between love and legal confusion. I reached into my leather tote and pulled out the thick, unmarked copy of the LLC agreement I had printed at home, setting it gently on the table. "I want to build a future with you," I said softly, injecting a slight, vulnerable tremor into my voice. "But I'm just so terrible with all this corporate terminology. I do not understand how transferring my mother's deed to a new company actually generates any immediate protection for us. Can you explain the cash flow part again? How does my dormant building help Ashdown Landing right now?" It was a carefully baited hook, a plea for masculine guidance, and Rhett swallowed it whole. Eager to display his financial dominance and completely convinced of my submission, he began to explain the mechanics of cross-collateralization. In his rush to sound brilliant, he completely abandoned the careful script. He started drawing diagrams on a linen napkin, explicitly detailing how the pristine, debt-free equity of my East Nashville property would be immediately leveraged to inject a massive wave of liquid cash directly into the Ashdown Landing operating accounts. He thought he was teaching a naive girlfriend the basics of high-level finance. In reality, he was loudly confessing to a devastating financial crime, outlining the exact mechanism by which my family's legacy would be instantly vaporized to pay off his toxic debts. I nodded slowly, absorbing every single word, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make them feel victorious. "I think I finally understand," I whispered, offering him a small, fragile smile. "I just need a few more days to read through the final pages." Rhett exhaled a long, heavy breath of relief. He squeezed my hand tightly, genuinely believing the war was over. He had no idea the battle had not even officially begun. I left the estate 2 hours later, maintaining my serene, compliant facade until my car was completely out of sight of the towering iron gates. The drive back to the city was a blur of adrenaline and cold, calculating rage. I had secured the verbal confirmation I needed. The financial betrayal was absolute and undeniable. I parked in front of my small brick house, the late afternoon sun casting long, dark shadows across the street. I unlocked my front door, dropped my heavy leather bag onto the hallway console, and kicked off my shoes. My phone buzzed sharply in my pocket. I pulled it out. It was a text message from an entirely unknown, masked number. There was no greeting, no explanation, no text at all. There was only a single, high-resolution photograph attached to the message. I tapped the screen to expand the image. The photo was taken from across a busy street, clearly capturing the ornate front entrance of an ultra-exclusive boutique hotel located in the heart of downtown Nashville. The timestamp stamped cleanly in the bottom corner indicated it had been taken at 8 o'clock that exact same morning, just hours before Rhett had arrived at the family brunch to kiss my cheek and talk about our sacred future. Stepping out of the heavy glass doors of the hotel were two figures. Rhett Vale was wearing the exact same clothes he had worn to the country club a few days prior. His tie loosened, his posture relaxed. Clinging tightly to his arm, her face turned upward in a bright, intimate laugh, was Celeste Brody, his project's aggressive public relations director. I stared at the glowing screen, the silence of my empty house pressing heavily against my eardrums. The financial manipulation was a cold, calculated business strategy, a desperate move by a drowning family. But this photograph was deeply, disgustingly personal. The betrayal was no longer just about stealing my mother's building. The personal treason was now permanently, inextricably locked onto the financial fraud. I did not throw my phone against the wall. I did not scream. I did not text Rhett to demand an explanation, nor did I reply to the anonymous sender who was clearly watching the board just as closely as I was. I simply walked over to the kitchen table, opened the thick folder containing the fraudulent LLC drafts and the aggressively inflated property appraisals, and printed a hard copy of the photograph. I slid the glossy image of Rhett and Celeste right into the center of the legal documents. It felt exactly like sliding a heavy brass piece into place inside a complicated clockwork mechanism, setting each part with agonizing, deliberate slowness, preparing for the moment everything would finally click into motion. My retaliation did not begin with a dramatic screaming match in a pristine driveway. It began with certified mail. On a bright Tuesday morning, I sat in the heavily air-conditioned, fluorescent-lit conference room of my newly retained real estate attorney. We did not waste time discussing my emotional state. We drafted a highly specific, legally binding notification addressed directly to the chief underwriting officer at the primary bank financing Ashdown Landing. The letter stated, in absolutely unambiguous terms, that any loan application, bridge extension, or collateral schedule listing my specific property in East Nashville was entirely fraudulent. I explicitly stated that I had not, and would never, authorize the use of my deed as collateral for Vale Meridian development. We sent it via a secure, bonded courier. I was quietly planting explosives on the very bridge Rhett was desperately trying to walk across, and I did not give him a single warning sign. I maintained the illusion flawlessly. Whenever Rhett called, my voice remained perfectly light and appropriately distracted. I blamed my absence on the hospital. I told him my department was undergoing a massive quarterly audit and that I was drowning in 70-hour work weeks. He bought the excuse entirely. He believed my distance was simply the typical, exhausting reality of a working-class job he secretly looked down upon. He texted me heart emojis and promises of a lavish European vacation once his project broke ground. I replied with smiley faces, quietly watching his digital lies pile up alongside the printed evidence scattered across my dining table. I let him continue to believe that my silence was submission, while in reality, I was carefully dismantling his entire future. 2 days later, Marin uncovered another crucial, devastating thread. She had spent her evenings quietly tracking down the specific public notary whose seal was stamped on the preliminary drafts of the holding company documents. Marin arranged a brief, completely off-the-record conversation over coffee at a small diner outside the city limits. The notary was deeply nervous and flatly refused to make a formal accusation on paper, terrified of the Vale family's legal reach. However, she admitted something incredibly damning. She remembered the specific file because an executive assistant from Sylvia Vale's office had demanded it be fast-tracked through the system. More importantly, the notary recalled noticing a distinct physical irregularity. The paper weight of the final signature page was slightly different from the rest of the thick document, and the top left corner bore the faint, unmistakable indentations of a violently removed staple. They had not just drafted a dummy corporation, they had actively swapped out the final page of a completely different legal document after it had already been notarized. They were preparing to seamlessly slip my forged or coerced signature into a fraudulent stack of banking papers. The arsenal against them grew even larger the following afternoon. A plain, unmarked manila envelope was slipped into the rusted metal mailbox of my East Nashville home. There was no return address, but I recognized the heavy, expensive ivory cardstock immediately. Inside were the heavily redacted, strictly confidential minutes from the most recent emergency meeting of the Vale Family Trust. Judith had bypassed her own brother's security protocols to hand me the ultimate weapon. I scanned the transcript, my eyes catching the highlighted text halfway down the second page. Conrad Vale was directly quoted, assuring the highly nervous board of private investors that the Ashdown Landing liquidity crisis was entirely solved. He explicitly stated that additional unencumbered real estate assets had already been fully secured to guarantee the bridge loan. He was actively lying to his own financial backers, betting his entire corporate empire on the arrogant assumption that I would blindly sign away my mother's inheritance for a diamond ring. Rhett, completely oblivious to the trap closing around him, was planning his grand finale for the very end of the month. The Ashdown Landing groundbreaking gala was designed to be a massive, glittering spectacle overlooking the river. It was the night he intended to publicly announce our official engagement, presenting me to the local media and his anxious investors as the beautiful, stable, and completely subservient future of the Vale family. He asked me to buy a new dress. He told me it would be the most important night of our entire lives. I looked him directly in the eyes, smiled softly, and told him I would be there, standing right by his side. While Rhett prepared the physical stage, his mother was busy digging my social grave. Through the hospital's upper administrative circles and various charity boards, toxic whispers began to trickle back to me. Sylvia Vale was quietly, expertly seeding a contingency narrative throughout Nashville's high society. She would corner wealthy wives at luncheons, offering a sad, sympathetic sigh while mentioning that Rhett's new girlfriend was struggling significantly to adjust to the intense pressure of their sprawling family. She painted me as fragile, overwhelmed, and perhaps a bit mentally unstable. If I refused to sign the papers and the relationship imploded, Sylvia had already laid the groundwork to dismiss me as a hysterical, lower-class woman who simply cracked under the weight of their immense legacy. I did not fight back. I did not defend myself to my colleagues. And I did not send angry messages to the women spreading the rumors. I understood a fundamental truth about dealing with arrogant, powerful people. The more they are allowed to speak without interruption, the more rope they happily braid for their own hanging. Let Sylvia call me unstable. Let Conrad boast to investors about assets he did not legally own. Let Rhett promise the city a beautiful skyline he could not afford to build. I wanted them feeling absolutely invincible right up until the floor gave way. The final, lethal piece of the strategy arrived via a brief, encrypted phone call from Judith. She spoke quickly, her voice a low, commanding hum over the secure line. She informed me that the night of the groundbreaking gala was not just a massive public relations party. It was also the exact night the family fund's board of directors was scheduled to hold a private, closed-door session in an exclusive suite at the venue, just 1 hour before Rhett took the main stage. The bank underwriters, the primary investors, and the family trust managers would all be locked in that single room, waiting for Conrad and Rhett to present the final, signed collateral agreements. "If you want to stop them," Judith said, the sharp chill in her voice cutting clearly through the static, "you cannot just break his heart in the driveway. You have to dismantle him in that room. You have to execute the drop in front of the money and the reputation simultaneously." I ended the call and stood up from my kitchen table. The house was entirely silent. I walked out of my apartment, descending the narrow wooden stairs to the vacant commercial space on the ground floor of my building. The air down there was thick with the smell of old dust, aged timber, and history. The space was dark, stripped down to the original masonry my mother had painstakingly maintained. I walked over to the exposed brick wall, raising my hand to press my palm flat against the rough, uneven surface. This was not just a parcel of land. It was my mother's exhausted spine. It was her sore feet after working 10-hour shifts in a sweltering cafeteria. It was the physical manifestation of her survival and her desperate hope that I would never have to shrink myself in a grocery store line. I closed my eyes, the cool clay grounding me in a state of absolute, unbreakable certainty. I was no longer just going to protect this building from a corporate theft. I was going to use it as a heavy iron anvil. I was going to make every single member of the Vale family permanently remember that their fatal mistake was looking at the quiet woman standing behind this brick and assuming she was nothing more than easy prey. The Ashdown Landing groundbreaking gala was held in the grand ballroom of a hyper-modern luxury hotel cantilevered directly over the dark, rushing waters of the Cumberland River. The space was a masterclass in aggressive, unapologetic wealth. Massive chandeliers constructed of jagged raw crystal hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting fractured light over a sea of designer evening gowns, tailored velvet tuxedos, and the kind of expensive, heavy floral arrangements that suffocated the air with the scent of imported white roses. The room buzzed with the low, confident hum of the city's elite. It was a flawless, dazzling theater production, completely masking the catastrophic financial desperation that was rapidly corroding the floorboards directly beneath their Italian leather shoes. Rhett looked absolutely magnificent. He wore a midnight blue tuxedo that fit his broad shoulders with architectural precision. As we navigated the crowded room, his hand rested warmly on the small of my back, his fingers applying a gentle, possessive pressure. He smiled down at me, his eyes crinkling at the corners with what appeared to be profound, overwhelming affection. He played the role of the deeply devoted partner with such terrifying ease that it actually made my stomach turn. He paraded me through the room as though there were no toxic legal drafts hidden on his corporate servers. as though there were no panicked text messages about securing my clean deed, and as though I had not seen a high-resolution photograph of him walking out of a downtown hotel with another woman just days prior. His mother was equally relentless in her performance. Sylvia glided through the throngs of wealthy guests, pulling me along by the wrist like a prized show pony. She strategically introduced me to the heaviest hitters in the room, the skeptical private equity managers, the nervous bank underwriters, and the influential city council members. "This is Lola," Sylvia would announce, her voice dripping with maternal pride as she presented me to a group of elderly investors. "She is the new heart of the Vale family. We are just so incredibly thrilled to have such a grounded, genuine woman standing by Rhett's side as he takes on this massive endeavor." She was expertly wielding my working-class background as a public relations shield. In a room full of slippery developers and leveraged debt, my lack of pretension made me look undeniably authentic. By explicitly linking my reputation to Rhett's, Sylvia was desperately trying to legitimize the fraudulent financial narrative they had sold behind closed doors. She needed these men to look at my honest face and believe that the Vale family foundation was entirely solid. Meanwhile, Conrad was holding court near the massive floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the river. He was holding a glass of scotch, his booming laugh cutting through the elegant string quartet playing in the corner. I stood a few feet away, sipping sparkling water, listening intently as he aggressively bragged to a circle of anxious fund managers. "I assure you, gentlemen, the capital is entirely locked down," Conrad boasted, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "All the conditions for the bridge loan extension have been met. The collateral schedules are finalized. We are literally just waiting for my sister to fly in and give her final blessing in the boardroom before we take the stage tonight. The dirt moves on Monday." He was standing on a massive, heavy bridge, proudly jumping up and down to prove its strength, entirely unaware that I had spent the afternoon methodically removing every single structural bolt holding it together. Judith arrived exactly 45 minutes late. Her entrance shifted the atmospheric pressure of the entire ballroom. She wore a severe, floor-length gown the color of slate, her expression an impenetrable mask of aristocratic boredom. She did not immediately approach our family circle. When she finally did, she offered me nothing more than a brief, chillingly polite nod. She completely ignored Sylvia's attempts at warm conversation and immediately demanded a private word with the catering director. I watched Sylvia and Conrad exchange a rapid, entirely transparent look of massive relief. Judith's public coldness toward me convinced them that she was firmly back on the family side. They genuinely believed they had successfully controlled the chaotic matriarch, or at the very least, that they had successfully controlled the narrative for this one critical night. Their arrogance was a thick, intoxicating drug, and they were completely high on it. 30 minutes before Conrad was scheduled to step onto the main stage to deliver the keynote address and officially announce the project, Rhett suddenly grabbed my hand. His grip was tight, urgent, and stripped of its gentle facade. He pulled me away from the crowded bar, navigating us down a quiet, heavily carpeted corridor lined with private meeting rooms. He pushed open a heavy oak door, pulled me inside, and locked it behind us. The room was small, dimly lit, and smelled of lemon polish. The muffled sound of the orchestra bled through the thick walls. Rhett turned to face me, the charming, boyish smile completely vanishing. He looked tense, his jaw clenching as he reached into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket. He pulled out a square velvet box and snapped it open. Resting on the dark cushion was a diamond ring so massive and flawless it looked like a weapon. "Lola," Rhett said, his voice dropping an entire octave, vibrating with a heavily manufactured emotional intensity. "I want you to wear this tonight. When my father finishes his speech, I am bringing you up on that stage, and we are going to tell the entire city that we are stepping into our lives together." He stepped closer, invading my physical space, trying to use his height and his magnetism to completely overwhelm my logic. "But I need to know you are actually with me," Rhett continued, his tone suddenly shifting from romantic to fiercely demanding. "I need you to promise me that the minute this gala ends, you are going to sign the holding company documents. No more hesitating. No more lawyers. You either trust me enough to build this empire together, or you are telling me you never truly believed in us at all. It was a breathtakingly manipulative ultimatum. He was attempting to corner me in a locked room, using the overwhelming pressure of a multi-million-dollar event and a massive diamond to force a blind legal surrender. He thought I would crumble. He thought my working-class insecurities would violently buckle under the sheer weight of his wealthy indignation. I looked down at the glittering stone. I did not feel a single flutter in my chest. I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical disgust. I reached out and plucked the heavy ring from the velvet cushion. I held it between my thumb and index finger, staring at the facets catching the dim light. I did not slide it onto my finger. I simply closed my fist around it. I looked up, meeting his desperate, demanding gaze with a look of absolute, terrifying calm. "I will not embarrass you tonight, Rhett," I said softly, my voice perfectly steady. It was the exact phrase he needed to hear. He heard submission. He heard a woman agreeing to stand quietly in his shadow and sign away her mother's blood for a seat at his table. He let out a massive, shuddering breath, his shoulders dropping 2 inches as the intense anxiety finally drained from his body. He smiled, a genuine, victorious smirk, and leaned forward to press a hard kiss to my forehead. "Thank you," he whispered, entirely blind to the fact that my promise was a highly specific, literal truth. I was not going to embarrass him. I was going to financially obliterate him. Rhett unlocked the door, sliding his hand back to the small of my back as we stepped out into the quiet corridor. We walked toward the private executive suite located just behind the main stage, the designated room where the family fund's board of directors and the bank underwriters were gathering for their final, closed-door session before the public announcement. As we approached the heavy double doors of the boardroom, a woman stepped out of the shadows near the catering elevator. It was Celeste Brody. She wore a sleek scarlet dress and held a silver clipboard tightly against her chest. As her eyes landed on Rhett, the polished mask of the public relations director slipped for exactly 2 seconds. She offered him a look that was heavily loaded, intimately familiar, and entirely impatient. Rhett did not break his stride, but he subtly tightened his jaw and gave her a microscopic, reassuring nod. It was a fleeting, silent exchange, invisible to anyone who was not actively hunting for it. But to me, it was the final, undeniable confirmation. Every single suspicion, every piece of metadata, every anonymous photograph was completely, brutally real. We stopped just outside the boardroom doors. Conrad was standing in the hallway, adjusting his silk tie, his face flushed with the adrenaline of impending victory. The private room behind him was packed with the men who controlled the financial oxygen of the entire state. Sylvia was hovering nearby, practically vibrating with excitement. "It is time," Conrad announced, clapping his son heavily on the shoulder. "The board is seated. The bank representatives are ready for the final signatures. We do this, and then we walk out there and own the skyline." Conrad turned, reaching out to grasp the heavy brass handle of the boardroom door. Right at that exact, breathless second, a sharp, synchronized sound shattered the quiet tension of the hallway. Inside the room, heavily muffled by the thick wood, a phone began to vibrate wildly against a mahogany table. Then, a second phone buzzed sharply from the pocket of the bank underwriter standing near the glass partition. A fraction of a second later, the sharp chime of an urgent email notification erupted from the tablet held by the family fund's lead attorney. 3 separate devices, belonging to the 3 most powerful men required to authorize the capital release, going off at the exact same moment. Conrad froze, his hand hovering over the brass handle. Rhett's confident smile faltered slightly, his eyes darting toward the closed door as a sudden, chaotic murmur of confused voices erupted from the men inside the room. They had just received the certified, expedited legal package my attorney had promised to deliver. The bombs I had quietly planted underneath their glorious golden bridge had just detonated. The heavy double doors of the boardroom were abruptly pulled open from the inside before Conrad could even turn the brass handle. The lead underwriter for the primary bank stood in the doorway, his face entirely drained of color, his phone clutched tightly in his sweating hand. The air inside the executive suite, which just moments ago had been thick with the arrogant certainty of incredibly wealthy men about to multiply their fortunes, had completely frozen. "We have a massive problem, Conrad," the underwriter said, his voice stripped of all professional courtesy. He did not look at Rhett, he looked directly at me. "My legal compliance department just forwarded an emergency injunction. It is a formal, heavily documented notice from Ms. Austin's attorney. She has officially denied any consent to utilize her commercial property as collateral for the Ashdown Landing Bridge extension. Furthermore, the package includes an independent appraisal, proving your submitted collateral schedule aggressively misrepresented the physical footprint and the assessed value of her asset." A deafening, suffocating silence slammed into the room. The string quartet playing out in the grand ballroom felt like it was suddenly echoing from a different universe. Conrad's face flushed a deep, dangerous shade of crimson. He immediately attempted to deploy the exact, misogynistic contingency plan his wife had been seeding all week. He forced a strained, condescending laugh, stepping in front of me as if to shield the room from a hysterical woman. "Gentlemen, please," Conrad projected, throwing his hands up in a placating gesture. "This is simply a massive misunderstanding. Lola has been under an incredible amount of stress lately. Planning a wedding, integrating into a family of this magnitude, it has caused a brief panic. She is just confused about the corporate restructuring. We will handle this minor administrative delay internally." "She is not confused. Conrad," a voice cut through the room like a steel blade. Judith stepped out from the shadows near the panoramic window. She walked slowly toward the center of the massive mahogany table, her slate gown moving soundlessly against the plush carpet. She did not look like a woman attending a celebration. She looked like an executioner arriving for work. "Stop insulting our intelligence," Judith commanded, her tone dropping the temperature of the room to absolute zero. She turned her piercing blue eyes toward the deeply anxious board of directors. "I want the internal email chains regarding River Thread Holdings projected onto the screen right now. The ones from my sister-in-law's office." "Judith, you have no right to hijack this meeting," Sylvia hissed, stepping forward, her flawless social mask finally fracturing to reveal the sheer terror underneath. "I hold the controlling shares of this trust, Sylvia," Judith replied, not even bothering to look at her. "I have every right to protect this fund from criminal liability." Judith turned back to the room, addressing the men who held the purse strings. "You want to know the true nature of this young woman's character? 3 weeks ago, my accounts were temporarily frozen due to a security protocol. I was standing in a discount grocery store line, completely unable to pay for my own food. Lola Austin, a woman I had never met, stepped forward and quietly paid my bill. She asked for nothing. She did not know my last name. She did not hunt this family for our wealth. My brother and my nephew hunted her to save themselves from their own colossal failures." The faces of the bank representatives hardened into absolute stone. The narrative was completely destroyed. The printed emails were distributed across the table, highlighting Rhett's exact words. He had brazenly referred to me as a clean deed solution. Another document proved Sylvia had ordered the fast-tracking of the asset merger long before Rhett had ever spoken the word marriage out loud. All eyes in the room slowly turned to me. They expected tears. They expected a dramatic, shattering breakdown from the naive, working-class girl whose fairy tale had just violently imploded. I did not shed a single tear. My pulse was steady, my breathing perfectly controlled. I walked slowly up to the edge of the sprawling mahogany table. I opened my right hand, revealing the massive, flawless diamond ring Rhett had tried to force onto my finger just 10 minutes prior. I placed it gently onto the polished wood. The heavy platinum setting made a sharp, definitive click that echoed in the silent room. "The most insulting part of this entire charade is not that you were desperate for money," I said, my voice carrying clearly to every corner of the suite, devoid of anger but heavy with absolute conviction. "I understand financial desperation better than anyone in this room. The most insulting part is that you looked at my kindness and assumed it was a weakness you could mortgage. You thought because I grew up poor, I would be so blinded by your chandeliers that I would let you steal the only thing my mother ever built. I looked directly into Rhett's eyes. He looked entirely hollowed out, the charming facade stripped away to reveal a terrified, empty man. I am not a solution to your debt, I told him coldly. And I am not your collateral. Before Conrad could attempt another pathetic defense, Judith delivered the final, fatal blow. As the majority stakeholder of the Vale Family Trust, Judith announced, her voice ringing with absolute finality, I am officially initiating an emergency forensic audit of the Ashdown Landing project. I am freezing all new disbursements effective immediately, and as of this exact second, Rhett Vale is permanently removed from his role as Executive Director of Development. The room erupted into controlled chaos as the bankers scrambled to call their legal departments. I turned my back on the collapsing empire and walked out of the double doors. Rhett chased me into the hallway, his heavy footsteps thudding against the carpet. He grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my silk dress. "Lola, please," Rhett begged, his voice cracking, shedding every ounce of his aristocratic dignity. "You have to listen to me. I love you." The money got complicated, but the relationship was real. You cannot just walk away because of a bad business strategy. I calmly reached into my small evening clutch. I pulled out the glossy, high-resolution photograph of him laughing with Celeste Brody outside the downtown hotel, along with the printed copy of the text message where he called me completely soft. I pressed the papers firmly into the center of his chest. He looked down at the evidence, his mouth falling open slightly as the absolute reality of his destruction finally set in. "I am not leaving you because I am heartbroken. Rhett," I said, my voice devoid of any warmth. "I am leaving because you priced yourself so incredibly low that you became nothing more than a dirty transaction. You are a terrible investment." I turned and walked toward the elevators, leaving him standing entirely alone in the hallway, holding the printed proof of his own ruin. The fallout was spectacular and merciless. Without the bridge loan and with the trust fund frozen, the investors immediately abandoned ship. Ashdown Landing was aggressively restructured by the bank. Sylvia was quietly but firmly asked to step down from her prestigious charity board, her reputation irreparably stained by the whispers of financial fraud. Within 2 months, Conrad was forced to liquidate his sprawling weekend estate in the mountains just to plug the massive cash holes he had arrogantly assumed my mother's property would cover. I did not look back. I kept my mother's brick building in East Nashville. I secured a small business loan on my own merits and spent the autumn developing the ground floor into a vibrant, sunlit space that served as a coffee shop and a free community consulting office for navigating complex medical billing. It was a space built on honest work, standing tall and entirely debt-free. 3 months after the gala, a plain white envelope arrived in my mailbox. There was no return address. Inside, there was a cashier's check made out for exactly $52.08. Folded neatly beside it was the faded, flattened Walmart receipt from that humid summer night, and a single piece of heavy ivory cardstock with a handwritten note. The elegant script read, "You did not owe me kindness, but my family owed you the truth." I pinned the receipt to the corkboard behind my desk. I looked at it every single morning. It was the perfect reminder of the ultimate lesson of my survival. I finally understood that the most powerful thing I ever possessed was not the brick building, nor was it the wealthy man who tried to claim me, nor the golden ticket into the Vale family empire. My true power was my ability to look manipulation directly in the eye, to maintain my absolute dignity in the dark, and to orchestrate the complete collapse of those who thought I was easy prey, right on the very stage they had built to destroy me. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I would love to know where you are listening from. So please drop a comment below with your city or country so we can connect and share our thoughts on Lola's journey. If you enjoyed this, please subscribe to the Daisy Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and show your support by hitting the hype button so that the story in this video can be heard by even more people.